I found it on a Tuesday morning, which felt wrong. Things that changed the shape of a war ought to arrive on some more dramatic day. Under a red sky, in the middle of a firefight, with trumpets. Not on a Tuesday, not in the scrub brush, at the eastern perimeter of a metalworking depot, on the rim of cataloged space. Not while I was out checking the fence line, because the motion sensors had been throwing ghost readings for 3 days, and I figured a coolant rat had nested in the relay box again. Emilio was with me. He was 22 that year, my son, already half a head taller than me, and twice as cautious, which I'd always read as a personality flaw, and later came to understand as simple good sense. He carried the sensor wand, and I carried the tool satchel, and we walked the perimeter in the early light, the way we'd walked it 100 times. The pale dust rising in small puffs around our boots, the fabrication shed humming at our backs, the black edge of the scrub brush stretching east toward the survey markers, and then nothing. Empty sector, no settlement within 400 kilometers. That was why they'd put the depot here.
Quiet.
Isolated. Focus. Emilio found the gap in the fence first. Not a break, the wire was still intact. Something had gone under it, pressing the lower strand flat against the dust. The impression in the ground was wide and shallow, like something had dragged itself across, rather than crawling the way an animal would. No tracks leading in. Whatever made the impression had come from the outside and hadn't gone back. I followed the bent grass into the brush maybe 30 meters. The scrub out here is waist-high at best, dry and silver gray in the early season, and it parts easily enough if you push. I was about to write the whole thing off, sensor malfunction, wind pressure on a loose strand. I'd replaced the clip myself, when I nearly stepped on it. It was lying on its back, or what passed for its back. At first I thought it was a man. Portions suggested that. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. The proportions were slightly wrong. In a way that took a moment to resolve, the way an optical illusion takes a moment before you see both images, and can't stop seeing them. The limbs were too long in the lower segment. The chest was too flat, almost concave. The head was the right rough shape, but the neck sat too far forward of center, and the face, pale, uniformly pale, a gray-white that reminded me of a weld that's cooled too fast. The face had no expression at all, which wasn't surprising given that it was dead, but the eyes were open and they were wrong. Not wrong in color, wrong in texture. They caught the morning light and held it in a way that living eyes don't, a way that polished glass holds light. I stood there for a long time, long enough that Emilio pushed through the brush behind me and said my name, and then said nothing else, because he saw it too. "We call it in," he said finally. "We will," I said. "Now, Papa, we call it in now." I wasn't looking at him. Was crouching down, not touching yet, just looking. The suit, if it was a suit, was a matte dark material that caught no light at all. A contrast to the face so stark it made the head look like it was floating. The hands, uncovered, had 4 fingers, long and stiff, and the skin over the knuckles was translucent enough that I could see something below. Not bone exactly. Bone-colored, but with a faint sheen, like the material you get when you fire silicate-rich ore at very high temperature, like slag that had been worked into structure. "Papa, I hear you. We call sector command. We document, we don't touch. We wait for the xenobiology team." He was right, that was the correct procedure. I'd read the contact protocols the same as everyone at the depot. All 12 of us. Though 12 was an overstatement given that Renata had gone back to the settlement for her sister's surgery and Vogt had shipped out the week before with the last materials run. 10 of us now if you counted correctly, and 3 of those were in the fabrication shed running the overnight bake on a structural order for a mining platform 2 sectors over. I thought about calling sector command. I thought about the xenobiology team arriving in, 8? The sector command response table for a biological anomaly at a Class 4 installation was not what you'd call urgent. And I thought about the 7 other contacts that had been reported in the last 18 months, each one documented and waited for and eventually retrieved by a team that arrived to find whatever had been found was gone. 3 times the body had simply decomposed. Twice there'd been secondary contact events before the team landed. Once the installation reporting the find had been destroyed before anyone could respond. The 7th contact had produced a live specimen. I didn't know what happened after that, because the report was classified above my clearance. But I'd heard enough secondhand from people who worked logistics at Sector Command to know that the xenobiology team had not been pleased with what they found when they arrived, not because of the specimen, because of what had followed the specimen. "We'll call it in," I told Emilio. "After we get it inside." He stared at me. He had his mother's eyes, dark and precise, and right now they were doing the thing she used to do when she thought I was being genuinely stupid. Not arguing stupid, not make a point stupid, but actually dangerous and wrong, and she would remember this later. "That's not the protocol." "No," I agreed. "If they find out we moved it, who's going to tell them we moved it?" "The documentation, the sensor log." "Papa, the fence sensor logs the breach at 0340. If the body is inside the depot when command arrives, the timeline doesn't match. Then we'll say we moved it for containment. Worried about secondary exposure at the perimeter." He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the body. Then he looked at me again. And I could see him going through the same calculation I'd already run. What the xenobiology team would do with it, versus what I would do with it. And whether either outcome was likely to matter. "You want to take it apart," he said. "I want to understand it." That's the same thing when you say it. It was. I'd been a metalworker for 31 years. Before the depot, I'd worked fabrication on mining platforms, structural assembly on 3 colony ships, and a decade in the heavy forge on Carrera Station, where they built the internal skeleton components for the early generation warships. I'd never been particularly educated in any formal sense. I understood materials. I understood how things were put together, and what happened when you pulled them apart, and what the parts told you about the whole. It was not a skill anyone had taught me. It was a skill that had built itself out of 3 decades of handling things that were not yet what they needed to be. I looked at this body, and I did not see a biological specimen. I saw a material I did not recognize. That was all it took. We carried it in before sunrise. The others didn't need to know immediately. Emilio and I had our own workshop space at the back of the main fabrication shed, a partitioned area I'd set up over the first year at the depot for prototype work, fitted with its own ventilation and its own lighting, and crucially, its own door. Built the partition myself, which meant I'd built it the way I build things. Heavier than it needed to be, better sealed than the spec required, and with a second latch on the inside that nobody had asked for, but that I'd added anyway out of habit. We laid the body on the secondary work table. The main table had a half-finished frame component on it. 3 days of shaping work I wasn't going to abandon. I covered the frame with a work cloth and set up the portable lighting around the secondary table and stood there in the new brightness, looking at what we'd brought in. It was approximately my height, 1.80 meters, and weighed less than I'd expected, less than a man that size should weigh. Not dramatically less, maybe 20%. I estimated that before we moved it and confirmed it when I weighed it on the platform scale. 61 kilograms, where a human of equivalent size would run 75 to 80. I wrote that down. I had a notebook. Actual paper, the kind I used for design work because I think better with a pen in my hand. And I started a new section in it and wrote down everything I could observe without cutting. Height, weight, general proportions. The skin color and texture. That gray-white, smooth at a distance but up close, showing a very faint hexagonal micro-pattern, almost like the surface of a graphite electrode. Visible pores, no hair on any surface I could see. The eyes, which I looked at for a long time. The sclera was the same gray-white as the skin, and the iris was a darker gray, and both surfaces had that same glass catch quality in direct light. Not polished smooth, more like cooled obsidian, fractured at the microscale into a mosaic, each facet catching light at its own angle. The hands, I kept coming back to the hands. 4 fingers, no thumb. The joint was present. I could feel through the skin that there were joints, hinge points where the fingers bent, but the range of motion, when I tested it gently, was less than a human hand. Stiffer. And the subdermal material I'd noticed at the knuckles was visible here too. That faint sheen through the translucent skin. I pressed my thumb against a knuckle, and the resistance was wrong. Not the give you get from bone padded with tissue. Something harder, denser, with almost no flex. I was 3 hours into my examination before Emilio said anything. He'd been quiet. making coffee, checking the depot's external sensors on the secondary monitor he'd pulled into the workspace. He'd called in the breach at the fence as a sensor malfunction. Coolant rat, exactly as I'd and logged it. He set a mug next to my notebook without comment. The orbital monitoring picked up 6 contacts in the last 48 hours, he said. Deep survey range. Not logged as ships. I looked up. Sector Command's interpretation is weather interference. Mining platform debris field from the Sorrento impact. What's your interpretation? He was quiet. He was 22 and cautious, and he'd grown up watching me work, which meant he had a good eye even when he didn't trust it yet. Fast-moving, consistent formation spacing, not debris. No, I agreed, not debris. I went back to the body. I had a decision to make, and not much time to make it. Correct course of action. Call it in. Wait for the team. Stand clear of the specimen. Was also the course of action that meant 6 to 8 days of sitting in the depot doing nothing, while something that was not debris and not weather moved in formation through the deep survey range. The incorrect course of action, which I was already several hours into, was the only one that gave me the sensation of doing something useful. I called Renata at the settlement and told her to stay there. I told her the sensor array had some issues and we were running a diagnostic that would tie up the communication channels for a few days. She wasn't suspicious. Sensors failing at the depot was a monthly occurrence, and she said she'd extend her stay since her sister was still recovering. Good. Then I got the cutting tools. A metalworker's toolkit includes things a surgeon would recognize and things a surgeon would not. I had blades, not scalpels, but small diameter rotary cutting discs and jeweler's saws, and a set of chisel tips I used for separating bonded composite panels. I had magnification equipment, a fiber optic probe, a portable spectrometer I'd bought secondhand from a geological survey outfit that had gone under 3 years prior. I had a small smelting furnace, nothing industrial. A prototype furnace I used for alloy testing, capable of reaching 1,200 degrees Celsius. And I had 31 years of working with materials and knowing what they were made of before the instruments confirmed it. I started with a surface scraping from the forearm, where the skin was thinnest. The rotary disc took longer than it should have. The skin had more resistance than I'd anticipated for something that looked so fine. And when I got through it and into the subdermal layer, the spectrometer told me something I wrote down and then read 3 times, because it didn't make sense at first. Silicon dioxide primarily. Structured crystalline inclusions. Tourmaline analogs, I thought, though the peak ratios weren't matching anything in the reference library. And a nitrogen matrix binding the crystals in a lattice arrangement that the spectrometer could detect the pattern of, but couldn't classify. I sat back and looked at what the instrument was telling me. Then I looked at the body. Then I thought, for the first time since I'd crouched in the brush that morning, the bones of this thing are made of glass. Glass. Not exactly. The word I kept reaching for was ceramic. The high-performance structural ceramics used in heat shielding and in the cutting surfaces of certain industrial tools. But that wasn't quite right either. Ceramic implied manufactured. This was grown, structured by biology into a load-bearing lattice that the organism had built inside itself, fiber by fiber, over however long it lived. The carbon-nitrogen matrix was the binding medium. The crystalline silicate was the structural fiber. Together, you got something that... And I did not reach this conclusion quickly. I reached it after 6 more hours of sampling from 3 different sites on the body. Had a tensile strength that my preliminary estimates, which I did not trust but could not dismiss, put somewhere between aerospace-grade titanium alloy and the hardened carbide we used for drill heads. In a living body, self-assembled, grown the way human bone grows, through a biological process, but producing a material that no human bone could match. Stopped and made coffee. I sat in the partition workspace, with the lighting humming above me and the spectrometer readings spread across my notebook, and I thought about what I was looking at. A species that had internally mineralized into a structural ceramic, species that had, consequently, no need for external armor. Its skeleton was already armor. A species that built weapons and ships, and presumably everything else it needed to survive an interstellar military campaign, and whose individual soldiers were carrying inside their own bodies A material that, if I could figure out how to smelt and shape it, might be worth paying attention to. Emilio appeared in the doorway. He'd been monitoring the sensors in the main shed. His face was flat in the way it got when he was keeping something controlled. The contacts in the deep survey range, he said. They've moved to mid-survey range. How many? The count I had at 6 may have been low. The resolution gets better as they get closer. I'm reading 11 now. Possibly more behind those. Time to depot intercept, he paused. At current deceleration, maybe 42 hours. I nodded. I looked at my notebook. I looked at the portable smelting furnace in the corner. Then I have 40 hours, I said. We need to call command. Yes, he said with visible relief. They'll respond in 6 to 8 days. The relief left his face. Which means, I continued, that command's response is not relevant to our next 40 hours. What is relevant is whether 2 men in a metalworking depot can do something useful before those 11 contacts arrive. He was quiet for a long time. Then he came into the workspace and pulled up a stool and sat across from me, looking at the spectrometer readouts in my notebook. He was a good reader of materials documentation. I'd made sure of that, and I watched his eyes move down the page and stop at the tensile estimate and stay there. You want to smelt the bones, he said. I want to find out if I can. We don't have a furnace that gets hot enough. Prototype barely reaches 2200. Full silicate melt is 1,700 for common glass. This isn't common glass. These crystalline inclusions. Tourmaline analog. Tourmaline doesn't melt, it decomposes above 1,100. This isn't tourmaline. It's a tourmaline analog in a carbon-nitrogen matrix. And the matrix is the key. The matrix is organic in origin, which means it degrades. If I can degrade the matrix below the crystal's decomposition point, the crystal structure releases. He looked at me. You're guessing. I'm estimating. Difference. What's the difference? I've been doing it for 31 years and I'm usually right. That was not entirely true. I'd been wrong often. But the times I'd been wrong in ways that were instructive, which I'd always considered the acceptable kind of wrong. We called Sector Command at hour 7 of my examination. The communication was logged. The biological anomaly was reported. The timeline was documented as best we could construct it with the fence sensor data Emilio had already modified. And Command's response was exactly what I'd expected. A xenobiology assessment team would be dispatched, ETA 6 to 8 days. In the interim, all personnel were to maintain distance from the specimen, document observations without physical contact, and await further instruction. Under no circumstances were personnel to attempt any manipulation of the specimen. I acknowledged the instruction, thanked the duty officer, closed the channel, and went back to work. Emilio didn't say anything. He was already recalibrating the prototype furnace's thermocouple array for a lower target temperature, which told me he'd made his decision. First attempt at smelting a sample of the silicate ceramic skeleton took 4 hours and produced nothing useful. The sample, a segment of finger bone, approximately 3 centimeters, which I'd removed with the jeweler's saw, sat in the furnace at 1,600 degrees for 90 minutes and emerged looking nearly identical to how it had gone in, slightly softened at one surface. The carbon-nitrogen matrix had partially degraded as I'd hoped, but the crystal structure had not released. It had instead done something the spectrometer could detect, but that I had no immediate explanation for. It had reorganized. Crystalline lattice, freed partially from the matrix, had collapsed inward and reoriented along what appeared to be a stress-response axis. The resulting material was denser and harder than what had gone in. I sat with that result for a long time. Then I wrote it down very carefully. It tempered itself, Emilio said, looking over my shoulder at the readout. Yes, when the matrix degraded under heat, the crystal structure, compressed, reorganized under stress, the way carbon atoms reorganize under pressure. You apply heat and mechanical stress in the right sequence to carbon and you get diamond. The matrix degrading was the heat component, but I didn't apply mechanical stress. So it's not fully tempered, not fully, partially, which means, if I can control both variables, matrix degradation temperature and simultaneous mechanical compression, I might be able to drive this to a fully tempered state. We looked at each other. A metalworking depot on the rim of cataloged space, 2 men, a prototype furnace, and 40 hours that were now 32. The hydraulic press, Emilio said. We'd have to modify the jaw geometry. The sample is too small for the current configuration. I can machine new jaws in 6 hours, he could. He was faster than me at the lathe work and more precise, which I'd always considered one of my few actual parenting successes. I sent him to the main shed and went back to my notebook. What I was attempting, I was fully aware, was something no trained materials scientist would have attempted without months of preliminary analysis. A controlled laboratory environment, a proper spectrometer rather than a second-hand geological instrument, and a committee of peers to review the approach. What I had was a good eye, a furnace, a press, and 32 hours. I also had a body. I'd so far removed material only from the hands and one forearm segment. The skeleton of a humanoid being is not small. If I was right about the smelting behavior, I estimated, mapping mentally against human skeletal anatomy, perhaps 8 to 10 kilograms of workable material available. 8 to 10 kilograms of a structural ceramic stronger than titanium alloy, self-tempering under heat and pressure, grown by biology into a precision lattice. I thought about what 8 to 10 kilograms of that could make in the hands of a man who'd spent 31 years making things. The Varenthis, I didn't have a name for them yet, that came later from the contact reports that were declassified after the war. At the time I thought of them as simply the thing in the brush, had arrived at Carrera Station first. 11 months before I found the body in the perimeter scrub. Carrera Station was where I'd spent a decade building warship skeletons. I'd left 3 years before the attack. The attack had destroyed the station in 4 hours, which I'd been told was unusually fast even by the standards of the other strikes. Carrera had been well defended, 3 warship berths active, a full garrison, 4 hours. The preliminary engagement reports, which circulated in the filtered form that reaches civilian installations, described an adversary that conventional munitions damaged very slowly and rail weapons damaged faster but still inadequately. The phrase impact-resistant biology appeared in one report. Another described projectiles flattening against the outer hull of individual soldiers who then continued advancing. Those reports were the reason I'd developed the palabulum sensor data carefully and the reason the depots in the outer sectors had all been issued the contact protocols that Emilio had quoted back to me in the brush. What no report I'd read had described was what I now understood, that the impact-resistant biology was skeletal, that the Varenthis carried their armor inside their skin, that the material forming their structural skeleton was, in its natural state, a high-performance structural ceramic that flattened conventional projectiles not because of exotic technology, but because of biology. The same way a human bone can be stronger than some metals, scaled and refined over however many millions of years into something that stopped railgun rounds cold. I wrote this in my notebook with great care. Then I wrote, underneath it, they don't know what their bones are made of any more than we know what ours are made of. They didn't develop this. They were born into it. Which means, whatever they think their armor is, however they classify their own resilience, they think it's a biological given. They don't think of it as a material that can be worked. That was my advantage. It was a small one. It was the only one I had. Emilio finished the press jaws in 5 hours and 40 minutes. I know this precisely because I was watching the clock on the secondary monitor with the particular attention a man pays to time when he is aware there is not enough of it. He came back into the partition workspace and set the jaw assembly on the workbench without ceremony. And I looked at it and turned it in my hands and did not say anything for a moment, because the geometry was cleaner than I'd specified. He'd taken what I'd sketched in my notebook, a rough dimensional guide, nothing more, and refined the curve of the inner contact surface in a way that would distribute the compression more evenly across the sample face. It was better than what I'd asked for. You modified the contact surface, I said. The curvature I had would have concentrated force at the edges. That's fine for a test sample. Plate work, you want even distribution, or you'll get a stress fracture at the compression boundary. He was right. I hadn't thought that far ahead because I'd been thinking about test samples. He'd been thinking about the plates. I sent him to sleep for 3 hours and let him go without argument. which was not my natural instinct. My natural instinct was to keep working, to keep both of us working, because the clock on the monitor didn't stop when bodies did. But I needed Emilio operational for the plate work, and Emilio sleep-deprived was less useful than Emilio rested. And I'd learned this through a decade of working alongside his mother on projects that ran long. She'd had the same capacity for focused work, and the same tendency to run herself past the point of useful. I'd made the mistake of letting her do it often enough to know what it cost. I let him sleep and I worked. I prepared the second sample, a longer segment this time, a full rhodius bone from the forearm, 11 centimeters, which required an hour of careful work with the jeweler's saw and the fiber optic probe to extract cleanly without fracture. The body was beginning to look less like a specimen and more like a material source, which I was not comfortable with but was not going to stop. The second smelting run, with the modified press jaws integrated into the furnace chamber, took 6 hours. I ran the matrix degradation at 1,550 degrees, lower than the first attempt, and introduced the mechanical compression at the 40-minute mark. When the spectrometer's surface probe told me, the matrix had degraded to approximately 60% of its original binding strength. The press applied 300 kilograms of force along the longitudinal axis of the sample. What came out of the furnace at hour 6 was not the same material that had gone in. It was smaller. The compression had reduced the volume by roughly a third, and it was darker, a deep graphite gray, rather than the bone white of the original. It was also, when I tested it with the hardness probe, substantially harder than titanium alloy. Not enormously harder. The difference was real, but not dramatic. What was dramatic was the weight. The compressed sample, despite losing a third of its volume, had barely lost any mass. The density had increased proportionally. I held it under the light and turned it in my fingers. It was warm. It had come out of the furnace warm, which was expected. But it was cooling much more slowly than it should have. The thermal retention was extraordinary. The material was holding heat the way a ceramic heat shield holds heat, not releasing it quickly to the surrounding air. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I wrote in my notebook, thermal retention comparable to heat shield ceramic, which means in an atmosphere, in direct combat. This material will retain the heat of a weapon strike rather than conducting it inward. Impact energy flattens the round. Thermal energy stays at the surface. It was armor that dissipated attacks the way water dissipates a stone's impact. Not by stopping the energy, but by distributing and retaining it across the surface layer, rather than transmitting it inward. I woke Emilio. We had 23 hours. He stood at the work table for a minute, looking at the press net sample in the light. He didn't say anything. He picked it up and turned it the way I'd turned it, and I watched his face while he held it. The same controlled flat expression he'd had when he'd read the tensile estimate in my notebook, the one that meant he was calibrating. "How much do we have left?" he said. "If I've read the anatomy correctly, and the skeleton runs proportional to a human skeleton adjusted for the body mass difference, is somewhere between 9 and 11 kilograms in workable bone. We've used fragments from the hand and the radius. Call it 9 kilograms remaining. And compression losses? 30 to 35% volumetric. Mass is retained, volume decreases. 6 to 6.5 kilograms of finished material in optimal conditions." He set the sample down. "That's not enough for full plate coverage on 2 people. No, so we decide what to cover." "Yes." He thought about it for a moment. He walked to the doorway of the partition and looked out at the main shed. The machines sitting quiet in the off-hours lighting, the overhead crane rails, the heavy press at the far end, the secondary bays where the grinding and polishing work happened. He'd grown up in spaces like this, not this specific depot. He'd come to work with me only 2 years ago, when the commission for the pining platform components came in large enough that I'd needed a second pair of hands I could trust. But spaces like this, the texture of fabrication work, the particular smell of metal at temperature, and the sound of machinery that was neither comfortable nor alarming, just present. He'd spent his childhood in workshops the way some children spend their childhood outdoors. "Chest," he said. "Front coverage only, center mass." That's what I was thinking. The vital organs are there. If the energy weapons are coherent energy, Rather than penetrating projectiles, the chest plate stops the thermal transfer. They have ballistic weapons, which the reports haven't described, but if the plate deflects. Either way, the chest is the calculation. The head is the obvious argument against, I said. The head is too complex to plate freehand in the time we have, and a helmet that doesn't fit correctly is a hazard. Leave it. I looked at him. 22 years old, working through the problem, the way I'd worked through problems his entire life. Not emotionally, not heroically, practically. Deciding what the material could actually do, and building toward that, rather than toward what you wished the material could do. All right, I said. Chest plates. 2 of them. The question was what to make. 8 to 10 kilograms of workable material after the compression losses. I revised that estimate down to 6. Accounting for extraction waste and the material I'd already used for testing, was not enough to armor 2 men completely. A full set of combat plate for 1 man would run, depending on thickness and coverage, somewhere between 12 and 15 kilograms. I didn't have that. I had was 6 kilograms of the most impact-resistant material I had ever worked with in my life, made from anything. I made chest plates, 2 chest plates, front coverage only, sized to Emilio and to me. I made them in the 3rd and 4th smelting runs with the press jaws geometry I'd finalized by the 2nd run, and I made them as precisely as I had ever made anything in my life. The shaping was done hot. The material was workable at around 900 degrees, stiff but not brittle. Using a hammer die I machined from the hardened carbide stock I had for drill heads, because nothing softer would have moved the material at all. I did not use molds. I shaped freehand, which was how I'd worked for the first 15 years before I could afford proper die sets. And it was slower and more variable, but it produced something that fit the body it was being made for, rather than a standardized form. Freehand work at temperature is a physical conversation between the maker and the material. You strike. You read what the material tells you about where the stress went. You correct. You strike again. Most materials have a predictable response. Steel moves this way, aluminum that way. Each alloy has its character, and you learn the character over years of handling it. This material had its own character, which I was learning in real time with no margin for error, and a clock I was trying not to look at. It wanted to move in planes. Steel has a grain you work with or against. This material organized itself along geometric axes. The same lattice behavior I'd seen in the spectrometer data, expressing itself in the macroscopic shaping behavior. Strike across the plane and it resisted. Strike along the plane and it moved cleanly, precisely in the direction the lattice wanted to go. Once I understood that, the shaping went faster. I was working with the material rather than against it. The plates took form over 4 hours of hammer work that left my right arm feeling used in the way it always felt after a long forge session. Not painful, just heavy, the deep muscle exhaustion that tells you the work was real. I made them thick at the center, 18 millimeters, and tapered to 12 at the edges. I curved them across the shoulder width to the natural contour of the body, with a slight camber to deflect oblique impacts. When they cooled, they were graphite gray, and slightly iridescent in direct light. The same faint mosaic quality I'd seen in the alien's eyes. And they weighed 2 kilograms each, which was less than half the weight of equivalent steel plate. I fitted the mounting straps from cargo webbing. Not elegant, but functional. The same material we used to secure platform components during transport. The straps ran over the shoulders and around the sides and buckled at the back. I adjusted them on Emilio first, checking the plate coverage against his center mass, making sure the shoulder curves sat correctly. He stood still while I worked, looking at the ceiling, not speaking. When I finished and stepped back, he looked down at his own chest and was quiet for a moment. "Looks like something you'd find in a museum," he said. "It might end up in one." He looked at me. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" I wasn't trying to be comforting. He almost smiled. Not quite. He pulled the plate off and set it on the work table, and went to begin work on the rail lance configuration, while I fitted my own plate, alone, in the workspace that had been our laboratory for the last 23 hours. I buckled the straps in the mirror and adjusted the shoulder coverage, and stood for a moment in the quiet of the partition, looking at the work table, at the spectrometer, at my notebook lying open to the page, with the tensile estimate, at the secondary table where the body had been. While I worked the plates, Emilio worked the weapons. This had been his idea. I'd get behind the armor, wait it out. And he'd been thinking further ahead, which was the difference between 22 and 53. And also the difference between someone who'd grown up hearing about Carrera Station, from a man who'd left 3 years before it was destroyed, and someone who'd grown up hearing about it from a man who knew people who had been there when it burned. Their armor is the same material, he said at hour 16, or something functionally equivalent. Whatever our weapons do to them now, flatten it against them, slow down, transfer energy without penetration. If we're wearing the same material, we have the same problem they have. Nothing gets through either of us. Assuming I've understood the material correctly, assuming that, so we need something that doesn't rely on penetration, something that transmits force without needing to pierce. I looked up from the shaping work. What are you thinking? The rail lance, he said. Prototype we were testing for the mining platform job. The rail lance was a commission piece we'd been developing for 6 months, a directed energy tool for breaking up hard rock formations at depth, essentially a focused magnetic pulse emitter mounted on a handheld chassis. It wasn't a weapon, it was an industrial tool, but a focused magnetic pulse, directed at a being whose entire structural skeleton was a crystalline silicate ceramic lattice. A lattice that, as I now knew, was held together by a carbon-nitrogen matrix that degraded under heat. The pulse would heat the matrix, I said, vocally. At depth, inside the armor, inside the skin, the matrix degrades. Crystal lattice collapses inward or on the stress-response axis, Emilio said, the way it did in our first smelting run. Except this time the mechanical stress is the impact of the collapse itself, inside a contained biological structure. I sat back. I thought about what that meant in practice. A focused magnetic pulse, heating the carbon-nitrogen matrix inside a Varenthis soldier's body, causing the skeletal crystal lattice to undergo spontaneous stress reorientation, to temper itself, in the uncontrolled direction, inside the organism. It wouldn't kill them immediately, I said. No, but it would compromise the structural integrity of the skeleton catastrophically. If their load-bearing biology works the way ours does, if the skeleton is what's holding the organism together, then a catastrophic skeletal failure would. Stop them, I said. Yes. He'd already pulled the rail lance prototype from storage. It was bench-sized, too large to carry, a problem, and its magnetic coil array was designed for a much wider dispersal pattern than what we needed. Focusing it was a matter of replacing the dispersal head with a concentrating barrel, which Emilio had already designed, and which I could machine in 2 hours. Reducing it to a hand-carried size was a matter of cutting the chassis to its minimal components and remounting on a handle frame, which was another 3 hours of work. We had 6 hours left when we finished. The 2 chest plates were cooling on the secondary work table. We'd made 2, stripping the prototype and the backup chassis that had been sitting in part storage since the commission began, were assembled and bench tested. The bench test was against a sample of smelted plate material. Pulse focused through the concentrating barrel heated the sample's surface by 340 degrees Celsius in 0.4 seconds, which degraded the surface matrix and drove a localized self-tempering event that cracked the sample along its longitudinal axis. A 6-centimeter plate sample cracking under a test pulse was not the same as a living organism's full skeletal structure failing. I was not certain of anything. I made a note of that in my notebook, and then I closed the notebook and put on the chest plate and tightened the side straps I'd fitted it with and stood in front of the mirror in the main shed's font washroom and looked at myself. I was 53 years old. I had silver at my temples and a scar across my left hand from a press accident 12 years prior, and the particular kind of tired that builds in a man over decades of physical work and doesn't fully leave with sleep. I looked absurd in the graphite gray chest plate. I looked like something had gone wrong in a science experiment, and a welder had ended up in armor, which was accurate. I thought about the men and women who had been at Carrera Station, not in an abstract way. I thought about Sergeant Technician Hildy Orvos, who'd been in the structural components team 2 years after me, who'd sent me a message when I left that said the place wouldn't be the same. and whom I'd never written back to properly. I thought about the senior foreman, a man named Senior Casalio, who'd been at the station for 20 years before I arrived, and who presumably was still there when it burned. I thought about the garrison soldiers, whose job it had been to defend the place, who'd had conventional weapons in 4 hours, and what it must have been like to pour everything you had into an adversary that simply absorbed it and kept walking. They hadn't known what they were up against. The materials were in the body the whole time, and no one had gotten close enough to look. I thought about that for a while. Then I thought about what was coming through the door in. Emilio had updated me 40 minutes ago. 3 hours and 20 minutes. And I thought about what I had in my hands. And I thought about whether what I had was enough. The answer I kept arriving at was, I don't know, but I know it's more than nothing. And it's more than what Carrera Station had. That was the honest calculation. Not heroism, not certainty, just the arithmetic of a man who'd spent 31 years working with the materials available and building toward the best outcome those materials allowed. I thought about the installation reports I'd read, the ones with impact-resistant biology in the language, the ones describing projectiles flattening against individual soldiers. I thought about the 11 contacts, now arrived at short orbital range. Emilio had confirmed that on the sensors 2 hours ago, and the formation had resolved into 14 distinct signatures, which meant my original estimate had been low. And I thought about the depot behind me, full of machines I'd spent 2 years building into something useful. I did not feel heroic. I want to be very clear about that. I felt the way I always felt at the beginning of a difficult job, a controlled, narrow focus, like a beam of light through a concentrating barrel, everything unnecessary falling away, just the work and what the work required. Emilio was waiting in the workshop partition. He had his plate on, and the rail lance slung across his body on a shoulder strap we'd rigged from cargo webbing, and he was standing with his back straight the way he always stood when he was doing the thing he'd inherited from his mother, rather than from me, waiting without fidgeting, being still while the world moved around him. We had 3 hours before the sensors showed the first landing signatures. We spent 2 of those hours moving every piece of completed and in-progress fabrication work into the secondary storage vault. The structural frame, the platform components, the prototype tooling, all of it. Challenge, I sealed the vault. Then we moved the body, what was left of it, into the furnace and ran the burn cycle at maximum temperature. I am not sentimental about this. The body had given me everything it had to give. What it was after that was a potential intelligence source for the beings who were landing, and I did not want them to have it. The 3rd hour I spent in my workshop chair in the quiet, with the notebook open, not writing, just holding it. The landing signatures resolved to ground contact at approximately 0440. Emilio tracked them on the sensor board and gave me updates without drama. 4 landers, spread across a 2-kilometer arc, consistent with a search and clear formation rather than a combat assault. They weren't expecting resistance. A depot, this size, this isolated, in this sector. By the time a Varenthis force was landing, the math of the campaign generally meant that whatever was here had evacuated or was no longer capable of offering a problem. They came through the main door at 0517, or 6 of them in the first group. I saw this from the partition doorway, which gave me a sight line to Sinshed entrance, without exposing me to immediate view. They were taller than I'd expected. The body in the brush had read to me as approximately my height. These were 15 to 20 centimeters taller, which meant either the body had been smaller than average, or something about a living Varenthis, carried differently than a dead one. Their suits were the same matte dark material, and their faces were visible. That same gray-white pallor and the glass catch eyes. And they moved with a measured cadence, unhurried, scanning the shed with a thoroughness that told me they were professionals. They had weapons. Chassis-directed energy emitters. From the look of them, nothing I recognized, but the general architecture was familiar enough. Coherent energy at range. Effective against human targets, presumably, in the way that conventional weapons were not effective against them. They moved through the main shed and found it empty. They spoke to each other in a tonal language that meant nothing to me. I did not know then what they were saying. I know now. from the post-war linguistics work, that the phrase one of them used, the one at the front of the group, who appeared to be commanding, translates roughly as already cleared, which meant they'd expected this. An installation this size, isolated, 2 men. They'd assumed we'd evacuated with the rest of the sector. They were confirming an absence, not hunting a presence. The commanding soldier was 3 meters from the partition door when I opened it and stepped out. I had the rail lance up and the charge already cycling. Emilio came through behind me, and whatever the Varenthis soldiers expected when they turned, which was probably nothing, or at worst a panicked human with a conventional firearm. It was not 2 men in graphite-gray chest plates carrying devices that looked nothing like anything in their operational experience. First pulse took the commanding soldiers in the center of its chest, at a range of 2.5 meters. I saw the effect immediately. A visible rigidity, a sudden cessation of all voluntary movement. The way a man seizes when a current goes through him, and then a sound I cannot describe adequately except to say it was somewhere between a crack and a chord. The sound of a lattice structure failing in multiple directions simultaneously. The soldier collapsed. The remaining 5 reacted fast. I'll give them that. They had weapons up inside a second. The shots hit me and Emilio both. The energy discharges were not designed for glancing impact. They were full strikes, and they hit the chest plates at range of under 5 meters. And the chest plates did what I had built them to do. Distributed the thermal load across the surface, retained it, and transmitted virtually none of it to the body behind them. I felt heat through the plate, the warmth of a forge at working distance. Nothing more. There was a moment. I'm certain of this, because I've thought about it hundreds of times since. When the 5 remaining soldiers processed what had just happened, their commander was down. 2 humans, in what appeared to be plates of their own skeletal material, were standing in front of them. Directed energy weapons at point-blank range had failed to stop either human. The moment lasted perhaps 2 seconds. 2 of them broke for the exit, and 3 of them opened fire again, this time at the unarmored portions of our bodies. Emilio took a hit to his left forearm at the unprotected section below the plate edge. He did not stop firing. Took a hit to my right thigh that left a burn I carried for 6 months afterward. I did not stop either. The fight in the main shed lasted 40 seconds. 4 of the 6 were down before the remaining 2 made it out the main entrance. And I heard them outside, and the pulse fire from their weapons against the depot's exterior walls, and then the sound of their formation regrouping. The other landers, converging, and Emilio and I backed into the partition workspace and sealed the inner latch. What happened over the next 4 hours is a longer story than I want to tell in full. The short version is, a Varenthis force of 14 soldiers, expecting to clear an empty installation, found instead an installation that killed 3 of them, with devices they had no framework to categorize, and the remaining 11 spent 4 hours attempting to breach a heavy-gauge steel partition door and its inner latch, while the 2 men inside kept them honest with pulse fire through a viewport I'd cut in the partition wall for exactly that purpose. The longer version involves the charge cycling time on the rail lance units. 40 seconds between full power pulses, which we managed by alternating. Emilio firing while I cycled, and I firing while he cycled. And the fact that the Varenthis made 3 serious attempts to breach the door and each time pulled back after taking a pulse hit to whoever was at the front of the breach attempt. They were disciplined soldiers. They did not throw bodies at a problem when the problem was costing them. They tried the door, lost a soldier, regrouped, tried the wall to the left of the door with what appeared to be a cutting tool. We heard the change in the sound, a high whine I didn't recognize, and I redirected the viewport angle and managed a pulse through the new gap they were cutting, which stopped that approach. They tried the roof access panel, which Emilio had welded shut 2 hours into our preparation, and I heard them working on it, and I heard it hold. In the pauses between attempts, they were quiet. I don't know if they were communicating by other means. They almost certainly were. But there was no vocal exchange we could hear, and the quality of the silence outside the door had a patience to it that I found more unsettling than aggression would have been. They weren't angry. They were methodical. They had resources we didn't have, time we didn't have, numbers we didn't have, And they knew it, and they were simply working the problem, the way a professional works a problem. Eliminating options one by one until something yielded. The thing that didn't yield was the second latch. The one nobody had asked me to install. The one I'd added out of 31 years of habit. Because a door with one latch is a door that fails at the latch, and a door with two latches at different heights is a door that fails somewhere else first. Cut through the frame at the lower hinge. I heard the pitch change, recognized it, when the response team hit their perimeter. Sector Command's Rapid Response Team, which had been scrambling since our report, much faster than the 6 to 8 days I'd been quoted, because the orbital signatures of 14 Varenthis landers had apparently clarified the timeline considerably. Arrived at hour 4. They came down hot, with actual warship escort, and the 11 remaining soldiers outside the depot had a different problem to deal with. I don't know what Command thought when they breached the depot and found us. I know what the first officer through the door said, which was a word I won't repeat, and which captured the general tenor of the response team's reaction. The chest plates they documented extensively, the rail lance units they took from us on the spot, which I'd expected, and the remains in the furnace they catalogued, which I'd also expected. My notebook they photographed every page of, which I'd not quite expected but understood. Emilio got the forearm burn treated and walked away. I got the thigh burn treated and sat in the depot's main shed while the response team moved around me. And I looked at the space where the secondary work table had been, now clear, and I thought about all of it. Formal weapons development that followed, the rail lance variants, the smelted plate armor, the directed matrix disruption technology, took 18 months. I was brought in as a consultant for the first 6, which is a word that in practice meant they asked me to explain my notebook to people with engineering credentials, and then asked me to wait outside while they discussed it. The chest plates I'd made ended up in a military museum on Carrera Station's replacement facility, behind glass, with a placard that described the historical significance accurately, but did not mention that they'd been shaped freehand by a man who'd been a metalworker for 31 years, and who'd had about 40 hours and very little choice. I don't talk about it often. Emilio does occasionally, with the selective precision of a man who knows which parts of a story land and which parts make people uncomfortable. He gets the forearm scar described as more dramatic than it was, and he gets the 40-second fight in the shed compressed into something cleaner than it felt at the time. And he gets the rail lance built as a finished piece of engineering than the jury-rigged tool it actually was. Don't correct him. He was there. He machined the press jaws in 5 hours and 40 minutes, and he thought of the rail lance, and he stood in that shed and took a hit to his unarmored forearm and kept firing. He gets to tell it however he remembers it. What I remember, when I think about that week, is simpler. It's the notebook in my hands in the hour before the landing signatures came down. It's the weight of the chest plate, lighter than it should have been, given what it was made of. It's the spectrometer reading I'd stared at for a long time on that Tuesday morning. Silicon dioxide, primary, structured crystalline inclusions, carbon-nitrogen matrix. It's Emilio's face when he read the same readout and stopped at the tensile estimate, and the way neither of us said anything for a moment, because the number was doing its own talking. Materials tell you what they are, if you take them apart carefully enough. You just have to know how to look. Shh. That's what I'd spent 31 years learning. That, in the end, was the only thing I had that the 14 soldiers outside the door did not. And it was enough.